Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be comparing the Cotman Winsor & Newton watercolors compared to their professional brand watercolors. Now, I did film these two paintings as a time lapse, so stick around for that. If you're just here to see this and to have me compare them, then I will put the timestamp here on the screen. But I thought it would be fun first to see how the paints re-wet, how they lay down, some color differences. And then when we go into the painting demo, I'll talk more about the lightfastness, permanence, pigmentation, and just overall quality. So stick around for that. Now, first off, I just wanted to show you some swatches that I've done. So these are all the colors that I have from both sets. So this is the Winsor & Newton Professional. This is the Cotman. So as you can see, there are some differences. So if we look closely here, the lemon yellow and Winsor yellow, you know, the cadmium red, Winsor red, alizarin crimson, the dioxazine purple, there's a huge difference there, just in pigmentation itself. And I hope you can see how the swatches have gone down. The professional swatches just went on a whole lot smoother. They blended out smoother, whereas some of the transitions here are not as nice. And these were both done on Arches cold pressed watercolor paper, which is 100% cotton. And I used the same method where I would lay down the pigment and then get some clean water and blend it out. And clearly there's a difference in some pigments being used, because as you can see, the Cotman line uses a lot of hues, whereas the Winsor & Newton, the professional line, just uses the regular pigments. So whenever you see a hue, it's sort of trying to imitate that pigment. So it's not the same pigment. Now, some of them I've noticed do use the same pigment, whereas the dioxazine and the dioxazine here, the Winsor Violet and dioxazine Violet, they have the same pigment, which is PV19, I believe. And the same with the ultramarine. They use the same pigment. So this is French ultramarine versus just ultramarine. But as you can tell, there's still a difference in there. So the Cotman brand, because it is a student grade brand, they do use a lot of filler in there. So there's more binder and filler versus more pigment. So that's the first thing we're going to notice, is the professional brand's going to be a lot more pigmented. Now I just want to check to see how they re-wet, how they lay down. And then I'm going to do sort of a wet and wet test here to see how they blend out. And to make this test as fair as possible, what I'm going to do now, all of these paints are dry, as you can see, and they sort of dry the same way. So a lot of these are harder. Some of these have dried a little bit better, but they've dried hard. So they're still using the same binder within the two. And to make it even, I'm going to dip my brush in the water, let it go off the edge of my cup, and then I'm going to do a few swirls. So 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to test. So these are the Cotmans here. And it's pigmented, but I mean, it's not huge. So again, I'm going to roll my brush off the side of the thing to get all the excess water off, and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, so 3 little swirls. And I hope you can see the difference there, just with the pigment load. So this is the PY154, PY175, Winsor yellow versus the lemon yellow hue. So they do have a different pigment, but just from doing that test, you can see how obvious this is more pigmentation. So I'm going to go ahead and do it for the other colors. I will time lapse this, but that's the exact method I'm going to use to try to keep it as fair as possible. So that's just the difference there between the pigmentation that you'll get from the professionals versus the Cotman. Now I chose these two here, the permanent rose and the French ultramarine versus the ultramarine, because they had the same pigment number being used. And the Winsor and yellow versus the lemon yellow hue, they just had a similar value, a similar color. So that's why I chose those. But I hope you can see, just using the method that we used, you get much more payoff with the professional brand. Does that mean you can't make anything with the Cotmans? Well, no, because I'm going to show you in the demonstration. I mean, there's very small differences between the two pictures. Now I'm just going to go ahead and start testing them wet on wet. And what I'm going to do is dip my brush in, just like I did with the other brush. I hope you can see that, because I'm trying to make this as fair as possible. Dip it in, run it off the side to get any extra water. And then I'm just going to do 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to dip my brush in, run it off the side. And I'm going to do that 1, 2, 3 again, and one swipe. And we're just going to let it blend out, let it do its thing. And I'm going to do that for all of them. So these will be the professionals up here and the Cotman. So I'm going to go ahead and time lapse that, and I will come back and show you the results. Okay, so as you can see here, I've done those swatches all the same. These are the professionals here, and these are the Cotman here. And the theme that I'm seeing is, obviously the Winsor and Newton professionals are a little bit more pigmented, but they also don't travel as much. Now, the ultramarine's an exception because that's a color just like alizarin crimson. It's just going to spread anywhere and everywhere. So because I know that, we still have the same. But as you can see, the ultramarine here spread out so much that you've lost a lot of that pigment, whereas we've still kept a lot of the pigment in the French ultramarine. And same with these. They've sort of just softened out. Now, because this is Arches cold pressed paper, we're still going to get nice transition areas. The edges are all soft, even with the Cotman. So it's not that you can't use them, but these are the differences. Now, I also went ahead and swatched the colors that I used for the painting. So this is cerulean blue versus cerulean blue hue, Prussian blue, and indigo, and lamp black. So you can see there's slight differences in variation between the colors themselves because of the pigments that they're using and the binders. But overall, they're fairly close. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the time-lapse video portion of this. And I did record the Cotman one first and the professional one second. And I did record the professional one in real time. So make sure to subscribe and stick around because that should be Thursday's tutorial if this is coming out on a Monday. So the first painting that you're seeing here is the Cotman Watercolors. Now they do have 40 colors in their range, and they start at about $5.19. Now that is US prices, so be sure to convert that to whatever your currency is. Whereas the professional brand has 108 colors, and they start at $9.69. So clearly the professionals are a little bit more expensive, but they have more than double the amount of colors, which I thought was really interesting. Now I will link the Winsor & Newton website down below in the description, but I'm going to be mainly focusing on the colors that I'm using here, the difference between them. So if we start with the cerulean blue hue versus the cerulean blue in the professional brand, they both claim to be a bright blue pigment with some green undertones. And I can see that in both pigments, maybe a little bit more in the professional brand versus the Cotman. So the pigment the Cotman uses for this one is PB15 versus the professional is PB35. So they are using different pigments. The Cotman one also says that it's opaque, whereas the professional one is semi-opaque. And the Lightfast for the Cotman one is a 2, which says very good, versus the professional, which is a 1, and it's excellent. Now they also differ in their permanence, whereas the Cotman is a permanence A, and the professional one is a permanence AA, which is extremely permanent. So the Cotman one's going to be more easy to lift, whereas the professional one won't be. Now, if we're just looking at the colors themselves, I actually prefer the Cotman cerulean blue hue over the professional cerulean blue because I like that it's a little lighter and it's not as granulating. Now, depending what you're using this for, you might like the granulating aspect of the professional brand, but usually when I want granulation, I'll reach for my Daniel Smith watercolors. Now, if we look at the Prussian blue in both brands, they both use the pigment PB27, and they both say that it's a transparent pigment. The lightfastness is 1, which is excellent, and they both have a permanence of A, meaning they can be lifted a little bit. Now, if you looked back at the swatches that we did at the beginning, they are pretty darn close. Again, I would just say the professional one is a little bit more pigmented and a little bit more blue, if that makes sense. Because if you can see the transitions between the Cotman watercolor piece versus the professional watercolor piece, there's a much more clear, distinct color difference between our colors. Now, if we go ahead and look at the indigo from the Cotman range, it's actually a mix of 3 colors, PB15, PB29, and PBK7. And the professional brand is also a mix of 3 colors, which is PB15, PBK6, and PV19, which I thought was interesting. And I think that gives it its much more bluish tone versus where the indigo from the Cotman range has a little bit more darkness to it, which I actually like that compared to the professional, but the professional one I would just mix in a little bit of neutral tint to give it that same darkness, and I still have all the other benefits from it. Now, they both claim to be opaque, a light fastness of 2, which is very good, and the professional brand does say that it is staining, so it would be a little less likely to be lifted than the Cotman indigo. Now, if we take a look at lamp black, the Cotman pigment is PBK6, whereas the professional brand is PBK6 and 7. And I think that's why it just has a little bit more opaqueness to it. Now, they both claim to be opaque and excellent light fastness, which is a 1. The permanence of the professional one is extremely permanent, so it's less likely to lift, but you get a much darker, richer black from it as well. Now, as you see in these demonstrations, I don't usually use black on its own. I always tend to mix in a color with it, and here I'm mixing in the indigo color with both versions. But you can see the version of the Cotman is a little more translucent than the professional one, especially down at the bottom where we're doing the bushes and everything. You can see how it's a little bit more patchy on the Cotman side versus the professional side. So all that information aside, let's just look at the paintings themselves. So I use the same brushes for both paintings. I use the Princeton Round 8 Neptune for all of the painting area, and I used my Silver Black Velvet 3/4 brush to lay down the water. Now, because this is watercolor, even though I've done 2 paintings and I've tried to copy them equally, it's never going to come out the same. So the consistency of the paint will never be the same. The transitions will never be 100% the same. So please keep that in mind. And any small differences between the 2 paintings can also be user error, as I did paint the Cotman one first and then the professional one. So I sort of think the professional one has a little bit of an edge on the Cotman one for that reason. And also when doing the bushes and the trees down below, I feel like I had a little bit better of an idea of how to do them once I got to the professional one, and my paint was a little bit thicker than the Cotman one, so there's that difference also. Overall, I think both paintings turned out really well. I like both of them. Like I said, I still like the cerulean blue hue color, and that might be a color that I will add into my professional palette. Or I found a color similar in M Gram, so I might actually add that one. So I still have the good light fastness and everything, but we'll see. But let me know down below in the comments below which one you liked better. Do you use the Cotman or the professional ones? Did you find this helpful? If you did, please give the video a like. Please consider subscribing to my channel. Come back on Thursday for the real-time tutorial of the professional ones. And thank you so much for watching. And as always, I will see you in the next one.